At the office Thanksgiving dinner, my sister raised her glass, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Sis, please stop asking for money," she announced with a theatrical sigh. Every eye turned to me. The head of compliance at Norcrest Dynamics, the company where she was the celebrated brand star. What she didn't know was that the $5,200 in credit card debt under her name was being paid off from my account. I wasn't doing it for love. I was doing it for the receipts. My name is Mara Quinn, and I am 32 years old. Tonight, Norcrest Dynamics was hosting its annual Thanksgiving dinner, and the air on the 28th floor of the Harborview Tower was thick with the conflicting smells of ambition and forced festivity. The scent of roasted turkey, heavy with sage, battled the sterile, citrus-tinged solvent from the floor-to-ceiling windows, which framed the glittering, indifferent lights of the city below. A long buffet table, draped in corporate blue linen, stretched across the atrium, sagging under the weight of stainless steel chafing dishes, mounds of buttery, pale yellow mashed squash, trays of roasted corn sweating under heat lamps, and the aforementioned turkeys, carved with ruthless efficiency. I was standing near a ficus tree, ignoring the bland jazz piped through the ceiling speakers, my tablet in hand. I wasn't mingling. I was cross-referencing the internal guest list with the access logs from building security. As head of compliance, I don't believe in casual observation. I believe in data. I believe in patterns. That's when the civilized hum of the party fractured. "A toast. Can I have everyone's attention?" My sister, Sloane Quinn. Sloane was the brand star of Norcrest, a title she'd essentially invented for herself. She stood in the center of the room, her sequined dress catching the harsh overhead track lighting, a full glass of Sauvignon Blanc held high. She was performance art, all bright teeth and curated charisma. I was policy, all footnotes and binding arbitration. She found me instantly, her gaze locking onto mine, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "I want to make a special toast," she announced, her voice resonating with a practiced, microphone-ready warmth. "To my big sister, Mara." A few people clapped politely. Turning to look at me, I kept my expression neutral, my posture unchanged. I did not raise a glass. Sloane let the silence stretch, savoring the spotlight. "Sis," she said, tilting her head with exaggerated pity, please stop asking for money." The words hit the air and hung there, vibrating and ugly. The jazz music seemed to fade. The clinking of cutlery stopped. It was not a joke. It was an accusation, delivered as entertainment. "It's just weird," she added, finishing her performance with a theatrical sigh. A vacuum of silence formed, instant and absolute. Then, it was broken by the worst sound, uncomfortable laughter. A few nervous titters erupted from the junior marketing associates who orbited Sloane like moons. A sycophantic chuckle escaped a mid-level manager from sales, a man I'd recently audited. Every eye in the room, over 100 pairs, pivoted from her to me. I felt the physical weight of their collective gaze. They saw Mara Quinn, the rigid head of compliance, the woman who enforced travel expense limits and audited email chains, being publicly shamed by her vibrant, successful younger sister. The narrative was irresistible, the boring, uptight sister leeching off the brilliant, generous one. My heart rate did not increase. My breath did not hitch. I simply made a mental note of the exact time, 7:14 p.m. On my left wrist, nestled beneath the cuff of my severe gray wool blazer, my smartwatch face was dark, but its microphone was active. The audio recording function was perfectly, unimpeachably legal, authorized under Norcrest's Workplace Event Documentation and Harassment Prevention Policy, Policy 4.1c(b). I knew the subsection by heart. I had drafted it myself 2 years ago, justifying it to the board as a necessary liability shield against he said, she said claims during company-sanctioned events. Tonight, the shield was mine. I let my gaze drift past Sloane, who was soaking in her moment. I looked toward the bar, where Grant Kearns, our interim chief financial officer, was leaning against the marble countertop. He was a man who wore his ambition like an expensive, poorly fitted suit. He wasn't laughing. He was watching Sloane with an expression of deep, smug approval. He caught my eye, and instead of looking away in embarrassment, he gave Sloane a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of collusion, of shared victory. This was a coordinated attack. The CEO was safely 30,000 feet over the Pacific on his way to Singapore, which meant Grant was the highest-ranking executive in the building. He was in charge, and he was endorsing this. Sloane, mistaking my stillness for defeat, decided to press her advantage. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a confidential stage whisper that was intentionally loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "I mean, honestly, Mara," she said, the scent of white wine washing over me. "We all work hard here. You should really try living within your means for a change. It's getting embarrassing for me." The atmosphere, which had been struggling toward festive, definitively curdled. The air thickened. People suddenly found the patterns on their plates fascinating. Amir from accounting, a man who usually greeted me with respectful fear, was now intently studying a bread roll. The vibrant orange of the mashed squash looked synthetic and sickly under the fluorescent lights. The energy in the room shifted from awkwardness to a kind of cold dread. They wanted it to stop. They wanted me to react, to cry, to yell, to fulfill the role of the hysterical, broke older sister. I did none of those things. Instead, I offered a small, thin smile. It was a precise muscular movement that did not involve my eyes. My eyes were busy. They flickered up, past the dangling, hideous metal sculpture in the atrium, to the northeast corner by the elevator bank. A small, black dome, the internal security camera, its tiny red REC light was glowing steadily. As per the memo I had circulated to the communications department last week, this event was being live-streamed to the company intranet. It was an initiative I had personally pushed, citing transparency and inclusion for our remote employees in the Dublin and Mumbai offices who couldn't attend the party. A chance for us to be one Norcrest, I had written in the proposal. Comms loved it. The camera was capturing everything. The angle was perfect. I bent down smoothly and retrieved a simple, elegant black document box from the floor by my feet. I placed it on the high-top table between us, the sound of the metal clasp clicking shut, echoing slightly in the tense silence. It sat next to a bowl of rapidly congealing cranberry sauce, the jellied kind that still showed the ridges from the can. "Thanksgiving gifts," I said. My voice was perfectly level, calm, and clear. "Thanksgiving gifts for the brand team." Sloane stared at the box. This was not in her script. Her performance faltered, her smile tightening at the edges. I reached for my glass. Not a champagne flute. I never drink at work functions. It was a tall glass of iced water, beaded with condensation. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clicked cleanly against the glass. Alcohol dulls the senses. It makes you sloppy. I needed to be sharp. I needed precision. The cold water anchored me. Sloane's eyes narrowed. She couldn't stand losing the spotlight, not even for a second. She gestured at the box with her wine glass. "Gifts?" she scoffed, recovering her bravado. "What's in there? Mara? More bills you can't pay? A request for another loan?" This was it, the final thread. I looked directly at her. I held her gaze. I watched the triumphant, cruel confidence in her eyes begin to waver, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty as she registered my absolute lack of distress. The performer was realizing, too late, that the audience wasn't laughing with her anymore. They were just watching, waiting. I gave her the smallest, slightest nod. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was a gesture of finality, acknowledgement, the end of her part of the script. "Good," I said. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the dead air like a scalpel. "You've said enough." The silence in the room was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. My words, "You've said enough," hung in the air. a stark contrast to the performative drama Sloane had just unleashed. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the practiced pity in her eyes replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Grant Kearns, by the bar, had straightened up, his look of smug satisfaction hardening into something more cautious. He didn't know the rules of this game because he didn't know it was a game at all. He thought it was just another family squabble he could leverage. That look on Sloane's face, I'd known it my whole life. It was the look she got whenever a consequence she hadn't anticipated finally arrived at her doorstep. We grew up in Milford, a town where the biggest ambition was to leave. After our father died, a sudden, quiet heart attack that left a void of noise and income, our family portrait was redrawn. Our mother, a woman held together by caffeine and sheer will, worked double shifts as a night nurse. The house smelled perpetually of antiseptic soap and reheated coffee. My teenage years were spent behind the counter of a greasy spoon diner, memorizing the uniform commercial code from flashcards propped against the napkin dispenser. My wages going toward the electric bill and groceries. Sloane's wages went nowhere, because she had none. Sloane was allowed to pursue her creative passions. While I was scraping burnt eggs off a griddle, she was at dance class. While I was balancing the diner's cash register at midnight, she was in her room, surrounded by expensive art supplies, sketching. The narrative our mother built was simple and unassailable. Mara was the strong one, the practical one, the one who could handle things. Sloane was the delicate one, the artist, the dreamer who needed to be protected from the harsh realities I was already navigating. Our mother wasn't cruel. She was just exhausted. It was easier to manage one crisis than two, so I was designated not a crisis. This pattern hardened into fact as we got older. I earned a full scholarship to study business law, a degree I chose not out of passion, but for its unimpeachable utility. I lived in the library, fueled by vending machine coffee, my world shrinking to the crisp, logical certainty of contracts and case law. Sloane, meanwhile, decided to become an influencer. This involved taking beautifully lit photos of herself in expensive clothes she couldn't afford. She called it investing in her image. 1 month. I came home from school to find our mother sitting at the kitchen table, pale and trembling, a credit card statement in her hand. Sloane had maxed it out on a trip to Miami for a networking opportunity. She just needs a little push, Mara, our mother had whispered, her voice frayed. The world is so competitive for a girl like her. She's soft. She needs our support. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. You're the one who knows how to handle these things. You're the one who's good with money. Translation: you're the one who can fix this. So I did. I took on an extra research assistant position and paid it off, bit by agonizing bit. Sloane never said thank you. She said I was lucky to be so good with numbers. Years later, when I had clawed my way into Norcrest Dynamics and ascended, rung by painful rung, to head of compliance, that dynamic hadn't changed. It had only scaled. When a junior position opened on the brand team, I was the one who forwarded Sloane's resume. It was a calculated decision. I told myself it was better to have her debt and instability contained within an ecosystem I understood, where I could monitor the damage. She thrived. Of course, Sloane understands the stage, the spotlight, the art of the charming narrative. She could sell ice in a blizzard. I understand the fine print, the audit trail, the importance of a signature in the right place on the right line. We were two different species. She built the fantasy. I managed the liability. In the small, private theater of our family. Her narrative about me became entrenched. At holidays, she'd regale our mother and stepfather with tales of my stinginess. Mara just doesn't understand, she'd say, shaking her head sadly over a slice of pumpkin pie I had paid for. She just squirrels her money away. She doesn't know how to live. The irony was a blade I had long ago learned to swallow. While she was painting me as a miser, I was on my laptop in the guest room, quietly logging into my bank account to cover her overdue car insurance payment, preventing a notice that would affect our mother's policy. I was transferring funds to stop her electricity from being shut off, preserving the family's credit rating, which, in a town like Milford, was a form of currency itself. But about 2 years ago, I changed the rules. My help was no longer a blank check drawn from a well of familial duty. It became transactional. I told her my own financial advisor was insisting on it for liability reasons. It was a lie, but it was a lie she understood because it sounded official. From that point on, my assistance came with terms and conditions. If I paid a bill, I required a digital copy of the invoice and a signed, dated email from her authorizing me to pay it on her behalf. This email had to include a specific phrase. In exchange for this assistance, I grant Mara Quinn temporary, read-only access to the account statements pertaining to this debt. I wasn't helping her anymore. I was acquiring data. I was building a case file. I stopped seeing her pleas for money as emotional blackmail and started seeing them as data points. The panic in her voice was a variable. The amount she needed was a number. Her signature was a binding agreement. I learned to measure her debt in cold, hard figures, not in feelings of resentment or betrayal. Emotion is a liability. Data is an asset. For years, Thanksgiving had been Sloane's ultimate stage. She would hold court. The prodigal daughter returned, full of glamorous stories from the city, while I sat silently. The boring spinster sister who probably counted her pennies before bed. She reveled in the role, and our family let her. They needed to believe in her dream, because the reality of my life, the relentless, unglamorous grind, was too grim a mirror. So tonight, when she stood up to deliver her performance, I let her. I had, in fact, counted on it. The live stream, the presence of Grant Kearns, the absence of the CEO. These were not coincidences. They were carefully arranged stage settings. Sloane had spent her entire life writing the opening act of her own tragedy, a story where she was the victim and I was the villain. She just didn't know that I had already prepared the closing argument. And the verdict was in. The black document box sat on the high-top table, a silent monolith between my glass of water and the congealing Thanksgiving feast. Sloane was still staring at it, her bravado evaporating, leaving behind the raw, familiar scent of her panic. She, like everyone else in this room, saw this as a family drama. They were wrong. This was a financial audit, and the audit began 18 months ago. It didn't start as a $5,800 problem. It started, as it always does, with a single, desperate text message. Mara, I'm in trouble, like real trouble. This time, I didn't just transfer the money, I ran her credit report. The total unsecured debt was $50,800, distributed across 3 major issuers, 2 high-interest visas, and 1 exclusive Amex. She had been robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on another, a classic, spiraling debt cycle. The interest rates were predatory, sitting at 24.99% and 28.99% respectively. She wasn't just in trouble, she was insolvent. I did not pay it off. Paying it off would have been a rescue, and I was not in the business of rescuing Sloane. I was in the business of risk management. A default on this scale, tied to a Norcrest employee, could create complications. A default tied to my sister would create a different, more personal liability. So, I stabilized the situation. From a private, ring-fenced bank account, one I had set up under a separate personal LLC for investment purposes, insulating it completely from my primary assets, I established an automated payment system. I didn't pay the balance. I paid the precise minimum monthly payment plus any accrued late fees. This specific action was critical. It kept the accounts active and in good standing, preventing them from being sold to a third-party collection agency, which would have complicated my data access. It kept the debt alive, simmering, and most importantly, it kept the statements coming. This is where my terms and conditions became legally binding. Before the first transfer was made, I had Sloane sign a notarized document. It was a simple, 1-page agreement, drafted by me, citing Familial Financial Assistance Act, a non-existent law that sounded imposing enough to ensure she wouldn't read the fine print. The document stipulated that as the facilitator of these payments, I was acting as her designated agent. For each transfer, she was required to send me a written email confirmation. I, Sloane Quinn, authorize Mara Quinn to make a payment of amount to creditor on my behalf for account ending in X6. Crucially, the agreement included a clause stating that, as her agent, I reserve the right to access, retrieve, and store all monthly statements and related correspondence for the duration of the assistance period, for reconciliation and accounting purposes. She signed it without hesitation. To her, it was just paperwork, another boring hurdle Mara was putting up. To me, it was a key. It was a chain of custody. For 18 months, the silent letters, as I called them, arrived, not in the mail, but digitally, as PDFs, directly from the creditor portals I now had access to. Every month, I would log in, download the statement, and file it in an encrypted, air-gapped hard drive. My system was meticulous. Each email from Sloane was saved as an EML file, preserving its metadata, timestamps, IP address of origin, server path. Every phone call I had to make to an issuer to confirm a payment, Sloane, naturally, often forgot to update her contact information, was logged. I would state at the beginning of the call, "This is Mara Quinn, calling on behalf of Sloane Quinn. Authorization on file. I am recording this call for quality assurance," which under local state law constituted legal consent. The MP3 files were cataloged alongside the statements. To ensure my own financial hygiene, I placed a full security freeze on my personal credit files with all three major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. This made it impossible for any new credit to be opened in my name, a necessary firewall to separate my financial identity from the toxic asset I was now managing. Sloane, in her initial panic, had even signed a document agreeing to this, believing it was a mutual protection measure. The statements told a story my sister never would. They were a map of her real life. I wasn't just paying down debt. I was acquiring admissible evidence. I began to see the penalty notices. The issuers, noting her patterns, started applying penalty APRs. I collected the official change in terms notices, the ones printed in tiny 8-point font, which cited repeated high-risk luxury expenditures. I cross-referenced the merchant descriptions, dozens of charges from high-end boutiques in the Brindleport district, restaurants where a single entree cost more than our mother's daily nursing wage. But it wasn't the clothes or the food that caught my eye. It was the other charges. Item: Apex Strategic Solutions, $4,500. Item: Brindleport Media Group, $6,200. Item: G.K. Consulting Services, $3,000. My blood didn't run cold. It became very, very still. I work in compliance. I live inside the company's vendor contracts. I recognize those names. Apex and Brindleport were two new, unvetted agencies that the brand department, Sloane's department, was aggressively pushing to get on the approved vendor list for the next fiscal year. G.K. Consulting, Grant Kearns. I pulled the merchant category codes, MCCs, for the charges on her personal card. Then I pulled the pending vendor applications submitted to my department. The MCCs matched. The addresses matched. The phone numbers matched. Sloane wasn't just spending lavishly. She was, it appeared, personally paying the setup fees or retainers for agencies that she and Grant were then trying to bring in-house at Norcrest. She was using her personal credit, her personal debt, to facilitate a corporate maneuver. This was the nexus, the point where her reckless personal life and her professional ambition had dangerously, stupidly merged. She was using my money, the payments I was making to keep her afloat, to fund what looked increasingly like a kickback scheme. That's when my objective clarified. I was no longer just managing a family liability. I was documenting a corporate one. I stopped paying to save her. I was paying to acquire the data. I was paying to build the trap. Every minimum payment I made was another steel bar in the cage she was building for herself. I was simply locking the door behind her. I was not rescuing her from the fire. I was meticulously logging the temperature, cataloging the accelerant, and preserving the ignition source. The plan needed a trigger, an endpoint. I calculated the total principal, 52,000. I set a new, automated payment schedule, increasing the amount slightly. I wasn't just paying the minimums anymore. I was strategically paying the debt down to zero. This morning, at 9:04 a.m., the final automated payment cleared. The total amount I had paid over 18 months, including interest and fees, came to 52,119.22. At 9:05 a.m., I logged into all three portals and downloaded the final, official statements. Each one read, balance, $0. I had my receipts, I had my documentation, I had the motive, and now, thanks to Sloane's performance, I had the stage, the witnesses, and the recording. The $50,800 wasn't a debt I was paying off. It was the price of admission. It was the fee I paid to purchase the entire goddamn theater. And as I stood there at the party, Sloane's face pale and uncertain, I knew the threshold had been met. It was time to start the show. The discovery wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a tremor. A single line item on a spreadsheet that didn't reconcile. It began 3 months ago. During the third quarter review, one of my junior compliance analysts, a sharp kid named David, who was pathologically meticulous, flagged a series of payments to a vendor classified as a micro-partner in advertising. The invoices were for digital ad placements, but the amounts were consistently 15% higher than the rates stipulated in the master service agreement we had on file. It was a small discrepancy, the kind of thing most departments would write off as a rounding error or a service surcharge, but my department doesn't believe in rounding errors. We believe in contracts. I told David to dig. He came back a day later, looking pale. The payments were all approved by Mr. Kearns, he said, handing me a stack of expense reports, and they were all submitted by Sloane Quinn's assistant. That was the first thread. I pulled on it. I have Level 7 administrative access to the Norcrest financial systems, a privilege I use with surgical care. I initiated a full review of all corporate T&E cards assigned to the brand marketing department for the previous 2 fiscal quarters. There were 6 cards in total. The one assigned to Sloane had the usual charges, team lunches, Ubers, conference fees, but a second card, a supplementary card under Grant Kearns's name, but designated for brand team project expenses, was the one that bled red flags. The transactions were a mirror image of the charges I had been tracking on Sloane's personal credit card statements. There were payments to boutique hotels, but they were coded as event space rentals. There were charges from 5-star restaurants, coded as client entertainment, and there were direct payments to the same vendors, Apex Strategic, Brindleport Media, that I had seen on her Amex statement. The amounts were always just under the $10,000 threshold that would require a secondary signature from the division head. As interim CFO, Grant was his own secondary signature. He was approving his own team's expenses with zero oversight. The pattern was identical to Sloane's personal profligacy. The only difference was the payment method. Fraud isn't just about the money, it's about the benefits. I shifted my focus from the expenses to the rewards. I submitted a formal request to our corporate travel partner for the activity log on Grant Kearns's executive travel profile. It wasn't an audit of his travel, which would have required his notification. It was a request for a rewards and benefits reconciliation, a perfectly standard compliance procedure to ensure the company was getting the full value of its corporate travel program. The data came back in a clean CSV file. Grant's frequent flyer points balance had tripled in the last 6 months. The source of the points wasn't just his own travel, it was from the brand team's card, which he had linked to his personal rewards account, a minor violation of policy, but not a crime. The crime was how he was spending them. I cross-referenced the redemption logs. 2 first-class, round-trip tickets to Aspen, redeemed in July. A 5-night stay at a luxury resort in St. Bart's, redeemed in September. I opened Sloane's public Instagram profile on a burner laptop. Her feed was a glossy catalog of those exact trips. There she was, posing on a ski lift in Aspen on July 14th. #brandshoot. There she was on a white sand beach in St. Bart's on September 22nd. #Norcrest Life. The dates were a perfect match. He was funding their vacations with company money, then using the rewards from that spending to pay for the flights. It was a clean, self-sustaining loop of fraud. I needed the raw data, the data that lived behind the polished interface of our expense reporting software. I contacted our corporate banking partner directly, invoking a clause in our service agreement that allows the compliance department to request raw, unfiltered transaction data for internal audit purposes. I wanted everything: transaction timestamps, merchant terminal IDs, authorization codes. I also requested the server logs from our IT department for every expense approval submitted by Grant Kearns over the past 6 months. The pieces snapped into place with chilling precision. The bank data showed that many of the high-value vendor payments were authorized outside of standard business hours, often late at night. The IT logs showed the IP addresses used for these approvals. They weren't from the Norcrest building. They weren't from Grant's home address, which I had on file. They were from public Wi-Fi networks belonging to the same hotels in Aspen and St. Bart's that Sloane was posting from. He wasn't just approving the fraud. He was committing it from the scene of the crime. The final, beautiful piece of the puzzle came from the vendor invoices themselves. The primary contact listed for Brindleport Media Group was an alias, Alex Carter. It was generic, forgettable, but the digital invoice PDF had a hyperlink embedded in the name, an email address. I ran the address through a series of forensic search tools. It had been used to create an account on a high-fashion e-commerce site 2 years prior. I subpoenaed the account records from the site's legal department, citing a potential fraud investigation. They complied within 48 hours. The shipping address for a $3,000 handbag, ordered under the name Alex Carter, was a private mailbox. The billing address was Sloane Quinn's apartment. She wasn't just submitting the fraudulent expenses, she was the fraudulent vendor. I had the full picture now. It was elegant in its corruption. Sloane would pay her own shell company using Grant's corporate card. Grant would approve the payment. The money would circle back to Sloane, funding her lifestyle, while Grant skimmed the travel points. I went back to the original contract file for Brindleport Media, the one submitted to my department for approval. It was a PDF. I downloaded it from our secure server and ran a simple metadata analysis. File created, August 2nd, 10:41 a.m. Author, S. Quinn. Last modified, by G. Kearns. Last modified. Date, August 2nd, 3:17 p.m. I checked the upload logs for the procurement portal. The contract was officially submitted by Sloane's assistant at 3:24 p.m. on August 2nd. Grant Kearns had made final, unrecorded changes to the document just 7 minutes before it entered the official record. He had edited the crime scene right before calling the police. With the evidence secure, I did the hardest thing. I waited. For 2 weeks, I watched them. I monitored their emails, all within my legal purview as compliance head. I watched their expense reports. I wanted to give them the opportunity to get scared, to realize their exposure, to try and cover their tracks. An attempt to conceal is a powerful admission of guilt. They did nothing. Their arrogance was a shield. They felt untouchable. In fact, they did the opposite of hiding. They planned a party, a big, public, company-wide Thanksgiving celebration, and to amplify their own perceived generosity and importance, they decided it should be a charity turkey drive, and to maximize their visibility, they insisted it be live-streamed. They built their own stage, sent out the invitations, and turned on the cameras. They handed me the perfect, unimpeachable venue for a public execution. That morning, 3 days before the party, I made a call. I contacted the lead partner at a forensic accounting firm that Norcrest keeps on a multi-million-dollar annual retainer for exactly this kind of situation. I invoked my authority as head of compliance and my protections under Section 7 of the Norcrest whistleblower policy. a policy I personally rewrote last year. I requested a confidential, expedited preliminary review of a potential case of executive fraud. I provided them with a secure link to a curated file of my findings: the bank statements, the IP logs, the metadata analysis. I told them I needed their independent findings in my inbox no later than 5 p.m. on the day of the Thanksgiving party. Their report arrived at 4:58 p.m. It was a single devastating sentence: "We concur with your assessment and find significant, credible evidence of financial malfeasance requiring immediate escalation." I printed their letter, put it in a sealed envelope, and placed it inside the black document box along with everything else. And then I went to the party, put the box on the table, and waited for my sister to say something stupid. I waited for her to give me the opening. I waited for her to say the line she was always going to say. "Sis, please stop asking for money." My statement, "You've said enough," settled over the room like a shroud, smothering the last embers of nervous laughter. Sloane simply stared, her face a mask of confusion. This was not the part she had rehearsed. In her story, this is where I was supposed to cry or run away. I ignored her. My movements were calm, economical. I placed my fingertips on the black document box and clicked the 2 latches open. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black foam, were not documents, but a stack of 50 crisp, white, letter-sized envelopes. I picked up the stack and turned to the tables nearest me, where the core members of Sloane's brand team were seated, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "As Sloane mentioned," I said, my voice carrying easily in the dead air, "it's a season of gratitude. I have a small Thanksgiving gift for each of you, a token of my appreciation for all your hard work." I began to place an envelope at each person's setting, as if I were a waitress delivering checks. I moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. I placed one in front of Sloane's assistant, who flinched as if it were hot. I placed one in front of the junior graphic designer. I continued, table by table, until every member of the brand team and a few key marketing managers had an envelope. Finally, I returned to the high-top table and slid the last 2 envelopes across the polished surface, one for Sloane, one for Grant Kearns. "Go on," I encouraged, my voice soft. "Please, open them." Hesitantly, a few of them tore at the seals. A moment later, I heard the rustle of paper all around the room. I watched their eyes scan the single sheet of paper inside. It was a heavily redacted copy of a credit card statement. Most of the information was blacked out with thick, unforgiving bars, but a few key lines were left visible. A date, a merchant name, Brindleport Media Group, and a charge amount, £6,200. On another copy, a different line was visible: Apex Strategic Solutions, £4,500. They were just fragments, meaningless on their own. I let the confusion build for precisely 15 seconds. Then, I lifted my gaze to the large projection screen behind the buffet table, the one that had been displaying a looping slideshow of smiling employees at the company picnic. With a click from the small remote in my hand, the slideshow vanished. It was replaced by a stark white screen, split cleanly down the middle, 2 columns of a spreadsheet. The left column was titled Sloane Quinn, Personal Amex Statement, ACCT, XXXX 8891. The right column was titled Norcrest Dynamics, Corporate T&E Card, ACCT, XXXX5512, G. Kearns, Approver. And then, line by highlighted line, the data populated the screen. Transaction codes, vendor names, and dollar amounts appeared in perfect, damning alignment. A charge for $6,200 to Brindleport Media Group on her personal card appeared next to an identical charge on the corporate card. Submitted 3 days later, a $4,500 charge to Apex Strategic on her card, mirrored by a corporate expense for the same amount. The list went on: hotel stays, consulting fees, equipment rentals, a side-by-side ledger of her personal debt and the company's money, flowing in perfect synchrony. The collective gasp from the crowd was soft. but palpable. I turned my head slowly to look at my sister. The color had drained from her face. "This is why I don't ask for money," I said, my voice slow and articulate, each word a carefully placed stone. "I pay for you. Sloan, I have been paying that Amex bill for 18 months. I did it. To keep the receipts." That's when Grant Kearns moved. The spell was broken. He shoved himself off the bar, his face a thunderous mask of rage and panic. "That's enough," he boomed, stalking toward the AV podium. "Shut this down. Shut it down now." He reached for the microphone stand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I simply held up a single, folded sheet of paper from my blazer pocket. "I wouldn't," I advised calmly. He froze, his hand hovering over the mic. His eyes darted to the paper. It was a letter, printed on the CEO's personal letterhead. I had received the email from his flight's Wi-Fi 2 hours ago. It was an authorization, co-signed by the head of our legal counsel, granting me full discretionary authority to present findings related to a sensitive internal investigation during the corporate event on November 23rd. Grant's face went slack. He wasn't looking at a rogue employee. He was looking at a deputized agent. On the secondary screen to the right, originally intended for a live charity donation tally, the company's internal chat feed was exploding. The live stream was still active, broadcasting this entire affair to our global offices. Comments scrolled by in a frantic blur. "Is that real?" "Holy S, that's the brand budget." "Wait, someone explain. Why do the numbers match?" Mara Quinn is a savage. The humiliation was no longer confined to this room. It was now viral, a permanent part of the corporate record. I held up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. "And just in case there's any ambiguity about intent," I said, my voice still perfectly even, "perhaps this will clarify things." I tapped the screen. Sloane's voice, tinny, casual, and utterly damning, filled the atrium. "No, I know. I know there's no paper contract yet. Just push the invoice through to Brindleport anyway. I'll cover the initial fee on my Amex for now. Just tell them it was a verbal agreement. Grant will sign off on the reimbursement later. He always does." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, the main doors to the atrium swung open. 2 uniformed security guards stepped inside. They were large men, calm and professional. They didn't approach. They simply stood there, one at each door, their presence a quiet, unarguable statement. I had scheduled their arrival with our head of security for exactly 7:30 p.m. It was now 7:31. I clicked the remote one last time. A final slide appeared on the main screen. It was a split image. On the left was a high-resolution scan of the official letter from American Express, dated that morning. The text was large and easy to read. Account balance, $0. Paid in full. On the right was a scan of the notarized agreement I had made Sloan sign 18 months ago, authorizing me to act as her agent and access her financial records. Her signature, large, flamboyant, and unmistakably hers, was at the bottom. Sloan took a stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with horror. She looked from the screen to me, then turned her gaze desperately toward Grant, a silent plea for help, for an explanation, for him to fix this. Grant Kearns did not meet her gaze. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, and stared at the city lights through the plate glass window. His shoulders hunched. He had just made a calculation. He was cutting his losses. He was leaving her to drown. The party was over. No one was laughing. No one was joking anymore. The chaos didn't last. In its place, a new, colder order began to assert itself. The transition was marked by the arrival of Eleanor Keating, our general counsel. She didn't rush in. She entered from a side conference room with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who owns the ground she walks on. She was flanked by a grim-faced woman from Human Resources. Keating was in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair cut in a severe, practical bob. She radiated an aura of expensive, billable hours. She was not here for the party. She was here to sterilize a wound. She walked directly to the AV podium, ignoring the stunned crowd. She held two thick cream-colored envelopes, her own version of my Thanksgiving gifts. Grant Kearns, Sloane Quinn. Keating's voice was not loud, but it cut through the residual shock in the room with the clean authority of a judge's gavel. Pursuant to Section 11, subsection C of your employment agreements, you are hereby notified of your immediate, indefinite suspension, pending the results of a full internal and external investigation into potential violations of the company's code of conduct, fiduciary duty, and possible wire fraud. She placed one envelope on the podium in front of where Grant had been standing. She walked over to Sloane, who was still frozen by the table, and placed the other envelope directly in her hand. Sloane didn't seem to register it, her fingers limp around the heavy paper. My part in the presentation was over. My role now was purely procedural. I stepped forward and met Keating by the podium. I didn't say a word. I simply held out the encrypted, solid-state hard drive. It was cool and heavy in my palm. "The complete file," I said. "All original statements, server logs, IP traces, call recordings, and email metadata as discussed, along with the preliminary report from Kroll Forensics." I also handed her a single sheet of paper. It was a chain of custody form, documenting every time the hard drive had been accessed, connected, or transported. It bore my signature and the signature of the head of our IT security, who had verified the integrity of the data that morning. Keating took the drive and the form, her eyes scanning the document briefly before she nodded. "Thank you, Mara. Your documentation is, as always, impeccable." Keating then turned to the crowd, who were watching this legalistic theater with a kind of terrified awe. "To ensure full transparency," she announced, "a representative from Kroll is on a video call." On the main screen, my final slide was replaced by the live feed of a man in a stark white office. He looked bored and tired, as if he did this 3 times a day. A small chyron identified him. "Marcus Thorne, senior partner, forensic accounting." "Mr. Thorne," Keating said, "can you confirm for the record that your team has reviewed the preliminary evidence provided by the compliance department?" Thorne blinked slowly. "We can," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Our initial review confirms the presence of significant red flags and anomalies consistent with sophisticated, multi-layered financial malfeasance. We have already recommended to the board that all associated vendor accounts and corporate cards be frozen, effective immediately." As if on cue, the woman from HR stepped forward. Her name was Brenda, and her job was to be the gentle executioner. "Grant, Sloane," she said, her voice softer than Keating's but no less final, "I need you to surrender your company access cards, laptops, and mobile devices at this time." Grant, who had been a statue of impotent rage, finally moved. He ripped the plastic ID card from his suit pocket and slammed it onto the table. He didn't look at anyone. Sloane, on the other hand, began to tremble. She looked down at her hands as Brenda gently took her company phone, then unclipped the access card from her designer handbag. Each action was a severing, a small, quiet amputation from the life she had built. While this was happening, I took out my own tablet. I logged into the master administrative portal for the company's travel and rewards program. I navigated to the user profile for Grant Kearns. I found the section for linked accounts. With a few taps, I revoked his administrative privileges and transferred full control of the 7-figure rewards point balance back to the central corporate travel department. The loophole was closed. The slush fund was gone. "We also have a representative from our banking partner," Keating continued. Relentless. The screen split, and another face appeared next to the forensic accountant. This man was younger, more nervous. "Mr. Davies, can you confirm you have traced the IP addresses associated with the approvals for the Brindleport and Apex invoices?" Davies swallowed, his eyes flicking nervously. "Yes, ma'am. We can confirm the final expense approvals were routed through public Wi-Fi networks originating from IP addresses registered to the St. Regis Aspen and the Cheval Blanc in St. Barts, on dates that correspond with the transaction records. Keating nodded. Thank you. Mr. Davies. She turned her attention back to the room. The company has already activated our corporate crime and fidelity insurance policy to mitigate any potential financial damages. A full report will be delivered to the board and the relevant authorities. She then looked directly at me. The camera, still live streaming, caught the motion. I also want to make it clear that Ms. Quinn has acted in full compliance with Norcrest's whistleblower policy and is therefore afforded all legal and professional protections therein. It was a public declaration. I was not a rogue actor. I was a protected witness. I met her gaze and gave a single, small nod. It was all the confirmation required. That's when Sloane finally spoke. The shock had finally burned away, leaving behind the raw, familiar substance of her rage. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "You ruined my life," she hissed, her eyes locking onto mine, shimmering with tears of pure, undiluted hatred. The room was silent, waiting for my response, waiting for the emotional climax to this brutal, sterile execution. I looked at her, my sister, the artist, the dreamer, the girl our mother always called soft. "You signed for it," I replied. My voice wasn't cruel, it wasn't triumphant, it was a simple statement of fact, a line item on a ledger. I turned and walked away from her, from Keating, from the whole mess. The buffet tables were still laden with food. A magnificent golden-brown turkey sat untouched, its skin glistening under the heat lamps. Platters of mashed squash and roasted corn sat pristine and uneaten. The feast was still there, but the celebration was over. The party had died. No one was reaching for a plate. No one was hungry anymore. I didn't stay to watch the final, pathetic exit. The security guards were moving in. Brenda from HR was speaking in a low, firm tone, and Keating was already on the phone with the board. The machinery of corporate justice, now fully engaged, was loud and efficient. I had become redundant. I stepped out of the atrium into the quieter, marble-floored elevator lobby, the scene of the party fading behind me into a tableau of stunned faces and untouched food. I needed a moment of sterile silence. My phone, which had been silent on the podium, began to vibrate in my hand, a relentless, buzzing demand. I looked at the screen. Mom, FaceTime. Of course, Sloane, stripped of her corporate credentials, had immediately turned to the only appeals court that had ever granted her clemency. I let it ring 3 more times, a small, petty concession to my own exhaustion. Then I accepted the call. My mother's face filled the screen. She was in the kitchen in Milford, the familiar yellow wallpaper behind her. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her face puffy with a familiar second-hand panic. She didn't say hello. "Mara, what did you do?" Her voice was a sharp, tearful accusation. "She called me. She's hysterical. They took her things. They fired her. You can't just do that to your own sister." The old script, the one where I was the aggressor and Sloane was the victim, the one I had been forced to read my entire life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I reached into the document box, which I had carried with me, and pulled out a single, crisp piece of paper, the original, notarized authorization Sloane had signed 18 months ago. I turned the phone's camera around, switching it from my face to the document. I held it steady, my hand perfectly still. I zoomed in on the signature line, on Sloane's flamboyant, curling signature, and the date, clear and undeniable, directly beside it. My mother was silent for a long moment. I could hear her sharp, ragged breathing. When she spoke again, the panic was gone, replaced by the deep, weary resentment I knew so well. You're always so calculating, Mara," she sighed. It was the worst insult in her vocabulary. It meant I was cold, unfeeling. It meant I wasn't soft, like Sloane. "You kept that? Like a trap?" I switched the camera back to my own face. I looked directly into the lens. "I paid $2,800, Mom. I paid it slowly, month after month, just to give her a chance to stop on her own. I paid it so she wouldn't be arrested for fraud 18 months ago. I gave her 540 days to stop digging. She made a mistake. She made a deliberate, repeating choice, and she made it with the company's money. I heard a muffled voice in the background, and then my stepfather's face crowded into the frame, his expression angry. "You listen here," he started, jabbing a finger at the screen. "Family is more important than some goddamn company. You protect your family. You don't throw her to the wolves." This, from a man whose mortgage I had silently helped cover twice. The hypocrisy was so pure. It was almost beautiful. "It's because of family that I did this," I said, my voice dropping to a low, precise calm. "I kept the proof so that no one in this family ever has to pay for her mistakes again. So you don't have to. So I don't have to. The account is closed. The debt is paid. The cycle stops." My mother just stared at me, her face crumbling. "You've ruined her." "She ruined herself," I replied. "I just turned on the lights." While I was speaking, the top of my phone screen kept lighting up, a cascade of iMessage banners, one after another, all from Sloan. "Mara, pick up. You can't do this to me. Meet me downstairs right now. I'm begging you. You bitch. You fucking bitch. Let's just talk about this. Just us. I'll pay you back. I swear." I ended the FaceTime call with my mother. I didn't say goodbye. I opened the text thread from Sloan. I read the frantic, desperate, and finally hateful messages, her entire emotional spectrum in 12 texts. It was pathetic. I typed a single reply. My thumbs were steady. "Your lawyer can contact legal." I sent it, then I tapped her name, scrolled to the bottom of the contact card, and pressed block this caller. I put my phone on the polished marble sill of the window. I turned it face down, so the screen was a black, silent void. I stood there, looking out at the city lights. I waited for the surge of emotion, the tears, the regret, the hollow, aching victory. Nothing came. I felt quiet. The grinding, relentless pressure that had lived in my chest for the last 18 months was simply gone. It was not joy. It was not sadness. It was the clean, cold, satisfying emptiness of a problem that had been permanently solved, a file that could be closed, a case that was over. I straightened my blazer. My hands were not shaking. I hadn't cried. There was nothing left to cry about. I turned away from the window and walked back into the atrium, back to my job, to where the lights were still bright and the final pieces of the old regime were being swept away. By the time I returned to the atrium, the landscape had been irrevocably altered. The guests were gone, ushered out by Keating's assistants with quiet, firm efficiency. The untouched feast was being discreetly cleared away by a catering staff who moved with the somber purpose of a forensics team. Sloan and Grant had been escorted out a service entrance. All that remained was the architecture of the disaster. The empty room, the cooling trays of food, and a handful of senior executives, including Eleanor Keating, standing in a tight, silent cluster. Keating saw me and broke from the group, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. "Mara," she said, her tone devoid of any emotion except business. "The board is convening. Now, conference room 4. It wasn't a request. It was the next procedural step. Conference room 4 was the fishbowl, a glass-walled box that overlooked the city from the north corner of the floor. Inside, the long, polished obsidian table reflected the ceiling lights like a dark, still lake. Most of the board members were already present. Their faces beamed onto large vertical screens that stood like tombstones around the table. London, Tokyo, Zurich, the chairman, Arthur Vance, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weight of quarterly earnings reports, was there in person, sitting not at the head of the table, but at its center. 2 other local board members flanked him. The head of the table was empty. It was the CEO's chair, a powerful symbolic vacuum. They didn't wait for me to sit. As the glass door slid shut behind me, sealing us in a pocket of pressurized silence, Vance looked at me, his eyes cold and appraising. "Ms. Quinn," he said, his voice a low gravel. "General Counsel has given us the broad strokes. The CEO has been briefed on his flight. This is an unmitigated disaster." He paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "Do you have a recommendation, right now?" This was the test. They didn't want apologies or recriminations. They wanted a solution. A path through the fire I had just lit. I had prepared for this. "Yes, Mr. Vance, I do," I said, my voice steady. I stepped forward and placed my tablet on the table. "Effective immediately. I recommend we suspend all active and pending contracts with any third-party vendors procured by the brand marketing department in the last 12 months. All procurement responsibilities for that division should be transferred to the Independent Procurement Committee, pending a full audit." I wasn't just cutting out the tumor. I was recommending a new, sterile surgical procedure to prevent another one from growing. Vance raised an eyebrow. "That will paralyze our marketing pipeline for the next quarter." "It won't," I countered, tapping the screen of my tablet. A new document appeared, and I swiveled the device to face him. "This is a list of pre-vetted, fully compliant creative and media agencies. My department conducted a proactive vendor review 6 months ago as part of our standard risk assessment protocol. They are all clean. They can be engaged by the IPC within 48 hours. A woman on one of the screens, Evelyn Reed from the London office, leaned forward. "Arthur, the CEO has already seen Ms. Quinn's preliminary report. I just received a secured email from him. He's incandescent. He grants Ms. Quinn full authority to liaise with the IPC and legal to ensure operational continuity. He wants the old pipeline burned to the ground and a new one built by morning." The confirmation landed with the force of a final judgment. The board exchanged glances. The path was clear. "There is one more thing," I said, my voice cutting through their silent consensus. "To avoid any possible conflict of interest, or even the appearance of one, I am formally requesting to be recused from any and all projects, reviews, or audits that involved my sister's direct participation over the last 6 months. My team can handle the handover, but my name needs to be off the paperwork." It was a necessary act of self-amputation. I had to prove that this was about the system, not the person, that my integrity was absolute. Vance stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a curt, decisive nod. "So be it." He looked around the table, at the faces in the room and on the screens. "All in favor of the recommendations put forth by Ms. Quinn?" A chorus of ayes came from around the world. It was done. Vance picked up a pen, a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen, and signed a document an assistant had placed in front of him. He pushed it to the board member on his left, who signed and pushed it on. The quiet scratching of pen on heavy bond paper was the only sound. As the document made its way around the table, Vance looked at Keating. "Have Grant's office and workstation sealed. Full forensic imaging on all his devices. Now." Keating nodded and spoke quietly into her phone. Through the glass wall, I could see 2 men from IT security walk past, heading down the corridor with a roll of red evidence tape. The resolution, now bearing a half-dozen signatures, was placed in a folder. The meeting, which had lasted less than 10 minutes, was over. I stood up. The overhead lights of the conference room were sharp and white, and for a moment, I saw my own reflection in the dark glass of the wall. I saw a woman in a severe gray blazer, her posture ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. I looked tired, but I was not bent, I was not broken, I was standing. A remarkable, if brutal, display of efficiency. "Ms. Quinn," Vance said, rising from his chair. "The board is appreciative. We will discuss a new role for you when the dust settles, a significant one." This was the second test, the reward. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "But I'm not looking for a promotion." He looked surprised. "Oh?" "I'm requesting a mandate," I said. "A mandate and the budget to implement a new, fully transparent, blockchain-based procurement protocol across all divisions. What happened in the brand department was a symptom of a systemic weakness. I'm asking for the authority to cure the disease, not just treat the symptoms. I hadn't asked for a bigger title or a corner office. I had asked for more work. I had asked for the power to build a stronger system. Evelyn Reed's face on the screen broke into a thin, rare smile. "Give it to her, Arthur," she said. Vance studied me for another second, then nodded slowly. "Done." He and the others began to file out of the room, their attention already moving on to the next crisis, the next fallout to manage. I remained for a moment, alone in the glass box. My eyes were drawn to the head of the table, to the powerful leather chair that sat empty. It was a stark reminder of the void at the center of all this, a symbol of the leadership that had been absent, allowing the rot to fester. The chair remained empty, and the air in the silent, glass-walled room was very, very cool. The meeting with the board had been the legal conclusion. This, now, was the eulogy. I walked back out of the glass conference room and into the main atrium. The exodus had been paused. A few dozen employees, mostly senior managers and those too paralyzed by shock to leave, remained. They stood in small, silent clusters, like figures in a wax museum. The air was thick with unspoken questions. They had witnessed the indictment and the verdict. Now they were waiting for the sentencing. Sloan and Grant were still there, standing near the entrance in a kind of surreal purgatory, flanked by the two calm security guards and the woman from HR. They hadn't been allowed to leave yet. Keating, ever the master of procedure, had clearly wanted all corporate formalities concluded on site. They were waiting for me. They were the final loose threads. I walked to the AV podium. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint, artificial hum of the building's ventilation system. I picked up the microphone. It felt cold and heavy. I pressed the small button on its side. The soft click echoed in the vast, silent space. I turned to face the room. I met the eyes of my colleagues. I let my gaze pass over Grant, who was staring at the floor, a man already erased, and then I looked at my sister. "Today is Thanksgiving," I said, my voice amplified, unnervingly clear and calm. "And on this Thanksgiving, I am thankful for receipts." I pressed the remote in my other hand. The screen behind me, which had been dark, flickered to life. It did not show a spreadsheet. It did not show a contract. It showed a single, clean image, a screenshot of an email from American Express. The subject line was simple: "Your balance has been paid in full." The body of the email was stark white, dominated by a single beautiful line of text in bold, green font. "New balance, 0,000. The entire room seemed to hold its breath in a single, collective inhale. The number hung in the air, a perfect, final, and absolute 0. Sloan made a small, wounded sound, a choked gasp. She stared at the screen not as if it were a document, but as if it were a cracked mirror showing her a reflection she could no longer recognize. The last vestige of her narrative, the successful star burdened by her needy sister, had just been publicly, digitally incinerated. "I paid this debt," I continued, speaking slowly, letting each word land with its own distinct weight. "I paid it to prove that I do not ask for money." I paused, and my eyes found hers again. "I paid it to demand the truth." I unclasped the watch from my wrist, the small, powerful recording device that had been my silent witness. I held it up for a moment, then placed it deliberately on the podium with a soft click. I pressed the button on its side, and the tiny red light went dark. Its purpose was served. The record was complete. It was no longer needed. I looked toward the main doors. I gave the head of security a single, sharp nod. He understood. He opened the doors. There was no struggle. There was no final dramatic outburst. There was only the quiet, profound finality of defeat. Sloan went first. She walked like a sleepwalker, her eyes vacant, her shoulders slumped. The vibrant, sequined dress now looked like a cheap costume. She did not look back. Grant followed a few paces behind her, a man twice his age, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for him. He walked out into the lobby and disappeared from view. They spoke no words of farewell. They offered no defense. They were simply gone. The doors slid shut. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the back of the room, came a single, sharp sound. Clap. It was a mirror from accounting. Just once. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Then, another person clapped, and another. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a hesitant, scattered ripple of applause. Less a celebration and more a collective release of tension, a punctuation mark at the end of a brutal sentence. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, then faltered and died out, leaving a new, less oppressive silence in its wake. I still held the microphone. I brought it to my lips for the last time. "No one owes anyone anything anymore," I said. Then I placed the microphone back in its stand. The event coordinator, a young man who looked like he had aged a decade in the last 20 minutes, caught my eye from across the room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. He turned to his console, and a moment later, the bland jazz music that had been silenced an eternity ago began to filter back into the room, this time at a barely audible, respectful volume. The spell was broken. People began to move, to speak in hushed whispers. A few, tentatively, drifted toward the bar, not for celebration, but for fortification. The party, technically, was continuing. But the story was over. I didn't wait for the whispers to coalesce into conversations. I didn't need to see the first person brave a cold dinner roll from the buffet. My work in that room was done. I turned my back on the ghost of the party and walked away. My footsteps silent on the thick corporate carpet. The path out of the atrium took me past the main reception desk for the executive floor. A vast, C-shaped installation of dark, polished granite that was currently unmanned. On the corner of the desk sat a small, tasteful silver tray. Inside it was a stack of thick, cream-colored cards and a single, elegant fountain pen. The cards were pre-printed with the Norcrest Dynamics logo and a simple generic message. "Thank you for celebrating with us." They were intended for guests to write notes of appreciation to the event staff or the company. I stopped. I picked up one of the cards. The paper was heavy, expensive. I took the fountain pen. Its weight was satisfying in my hand. I opened the document box I was still carrying and took out one of the photocopies I had made. The clean, beautiful statement from American Express, confirming a zero balance. I folded the photocopy neatly and tucked it inside the thank you card. Then, on the blank space inside the card, beneath the corporate logo, I wrote 2 words. My handwriting was not like Sloane's. It was not a flamboyant, looping script. It was a precise, clear, and legible block print. "Happy Thanksgiving." I placed the card back on the silver tray. Separate from the others, a single, sealed message for whoever found it, a final receipt. Then I walked to the elevator bank and pressed the down button. The elevator arrived with a soft, expensive chime. The doors slid open onto an empty car, all polished steel and soft, indirect lighting. I stepped inside and turned to face the front. As the doors slid shut, I saw my reflection for a moment in their mirrored surface. A woman in a gray blazer, her face pale under the harsh lighting, her expression utterly, completely placid. There were no tear tracks. There was no triumphant smirk. There was only the quiet stillness of a finished task. The elevator began its smooth, rapid descent. The numbers on the display above the door lit up and vanished in a silent, downward cascade. 27, 26, 25. My phone, which I had put back in my blazer pocket, vibrated once, a soft, single pulse against my ribs. I pulled it out. The screen was lit with an email notification. From A. Vance, Chairman, Board of Directors. Subject, Re. Proposed Control Protocol, Body, Approved. Proceed as outlined. I read the words. They registered not as a victory, but as a simple, logical outcome. An administrative loose end being tied up. I pressed the power button, and the screen went dark. I didn't need to read it again. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked up at the numbers. 12, 11, 10. I watched them fall, each one a floor I was leaving behind, a layer of the past I was shedding. This descent was the opposite of my career. My entire adult life had been a climb, a slow, relentless ascent, fueled by work and discipline and the quiet, gnawing pressure of being the strong one. For the first time, I was simply falling, and it was effortless. 3, 2, 1. The elevator slowed with a gentle sigh of hydraulics, a final chime, and the doors slid open. The air that greeted me was different. It was not the climate-controlled, recycled air of the upper floors. It was cooler, heavier, and it carried the faint, unmistakable scent of the city at night. Salt and cold from the nearby harbor, mingling with the exhaust of passing cars. The ground-floor lobby was a cavern of marble and glass, empty except for a lone security guard who watched me from a distance but made no move to approach. The sound of my heels echoed in the vast space. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anything but the massive, revolving glass doors that led to the street. I pushed through them and stepped out into the November night. The wind off the water was sharp and cold. It whipped a loose strand of my hair across my face, and I didn't bother to brush it away. The noise of the city rushed in, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a subway deep beneath the pavement, the murmur of a world that had not stopped for my private war. I pushed my hands deep into the pockets of my wool coat. The fabric was rough and warm. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold air scour my face, feeling the vibrations of the city through the soles of my shoes. There were no more calls to make, no more texts to send or block. There was no need to speak to anyone else. There was no need for another family dinner. I turned left and began to walk, my destination unknown, my pace steady, melting into the anonymous, indifferent flow of the city. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and you can share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support what I do, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by so many more people.